although the question says Bret Hart negotiating with WCW in 1992, you'll see in a second why I think maybe he's referring to this period of time. There were a lot of rumors. We've discussed them on John Arezzi's Pro Wrestling Spotlight Then and Now. We're covering this period of time in 1989, the original broadcast. Dave Meltzer's on some of those shows. John talks about what's been on in the news and what rumors he's hearing. So with that said, let me read you the question here. Hi, Jim and Brian. Recently, I was watching a shoot interview with Bret Hart where he mentioned that following losing the Intercontinental title to the Mountie in January 1992, he spoke with Brian Pillman, who mentioned he can get a better deal in WCW than what he was currently getting in the WWF. Bret stated that he spoke to Jim Barnett and later Kevin Sullivan, and ultimately they were unable to offer him a better deal. Bret was also upset over rumors getting out to the dirt sheets, and thus he stayed where he was. So I guess the question is, not talking necessarily with the 92 negotiation, because you would have had no involvement whatsoever in any of that.
Yeah, I wasn't even there.
Do you remember? Because he mentioned, and Kevin Sullivan wasn't there either. So that's what made me think back to 1989, Jim Barnett and Kevin Sullivan he spoke to. Do you remember any talks while you were on the booking committee about Bret Hart potentially coming in? Because it was a big rumor in wrestling.
You know, I think somebody's asked me this before, and no, I don't really. But then again, why would I? Because to me, in 1989, Bret Hart was not the answer to anything. Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil Neidhart had been the WWF Tag Team Champions. I didn't watch WWF. Even back then, it was too cartoony. So it wasn't until Bret started being pushed as a single in the early 90s and started having those great matches that, and didn't he and Hennig have a fucking just a hell of a match at SummerSlam
91,
one year?
1991.
That,
yeah.
You know what? That's when Bret Hart got over with me because Bobby Eaton and I was still living in Charlotte. And Bobby was still working for WCW, but I had quit, me and Stan. And I went over to Bobby's house and he said, "Did you see this?" And we watched that match. And Bobby was just thrilled with both of them. And I was too. And I said, wow, that's when Bret Hart started to be somebody to me. It would have just been to me in 1989, to be honest, a former WWF tag team guy, wanting to come in. Bret Hart was not really, that big a deal to me. So I wouldn't have remembered it. So I don't really remember it. There may have been talks. Who the fuck knows? I know that after Herd fucked Tully and Arn, we never had any other talks from anybody that actually had a job in WWF wanting to come there because Herd had poisoned the well. Basically, Flair had made the deal for Tully and Arn to come back from the WWF and reform the Horsemen, which would have done tremendous at the time because people were longing for a callback to the old days when the shit was any good. And Herd had agreed to it, and then Tully and Arn finish up at Survivor Series. Tully flunks the drug test in the WWF on the way out. Herd hears about it and won't hire Tully at all for any amount of money because he flunked a fucking drug test in another company, even when I suggested. It's the first time I ever heard Jim Ross use the phrase, "Are you going to die on that hill?" When I wouldn't stop browbeating Jim Herd. How about you send him to rehab and then put out a press release saying you sent a fucking wrestler to rehab and turned his life around? And that made too much sense. That's why Herd would harumph it. I hated that motherfucker. I wanted to pull his eyeballs out. But anyway, so he fucks Tully on the contract and ends Tully's Major League Wrestling career. And because Arn was not as valuable to him as a single as he was in a tag team, he cut Arn's salary by $100,000 and only offered him $150 when Arn had already agreed to $250 and fucked Arn. And Arn had no place to go to make that money now because he'd given it notice to the WWF. So I'm surprised that Arn didn't fucking pull Jim Herd's eyeballs out. And after that, nobody in the WWF except people who knew they were going to be fired or had already been fired would contact WCW until Herd was gone, which was another couple of years. So that's another thing he did for us. So what was the question?
Bret Hart and WCW.
I don't fucking know. How about that?